When you think of the most important characters in anime, you probably think of the protagonist. The Gokus, the Luffys, the Aleutias, the characters who carry the story on their backs and are almost always at the center of everything. But what about the characters who aren't the main character? Because being a side character, in my opinion, is actually one of the hardest roles to pull off in anime. A bad side character is someone who exists for one reason. Maybe they're there to make the protagonist look cooler. Maybe they're there for, comic relief reasons or whatever, right? And once their job in the story is finished, there's really no reason to care about them anymore. But a great side character, to me, is a little bit different. A great side character can make you forget that they're even a side character in the first place. They make their own personality, their own problems, their own relationships, and most importantly, their own story. And when you take all that into consideration, there is one character who I think represents the perfect side character better than anyone else, and that is Yu Ishigami from Kaguya-sama Love is War. Because Ishigami isn't just funny, he isn't just relatable, and he isn't just the guy who happens to be sitting in the student council room. Ishigami is one of the most well-written characters in the entire series, and his story is so good that if Kaguya-sama decided to give him his own anime, I would have probably watched the entire thing. So today, I want to explain why Yu Ishigami is the best side character in anime history. When Ishigami is first introduced, he's not exactly what you would call impressive. He's the treasurer of the Shuchin Academy Student Council, he's antisocial, he's constantly playing video games, he wears headphones basically everywhere, he doesn't like talking to people, and he's incredibly pessimistic. Basically, Ishigami looks like the kind of character who would spend the entire anime sitting in the background making sarcastic comments, and honestly, that's pretty much what he does at first. But there's something interesting about Ishigami. Even though he constantly complains about the people around him, he's actually incredibly observant. He notices things that everyone else misses. He can tell when something is wrong with people, and despite pretending that he doesn't care about anyone, he cares a lot. The problem is that nobody else really knows that, and that leads directly into the most important part of Ishigami's character, which is, of course, his backstory. Now, if you've watched Kaguya-sama, you probably already know about Ishigami's backstory, so I'm not going to spend 5 minutes explaining every detail about it. Basically, Ishigami found out that Ogino was treating his girlfriend horribly, and he tried to stop him, but the situation was misunderstood, and Ishigami ended up being seen as the bad guy. He was suspended, everyone started avoiding him, and his reputation was basically ruined. And the important part is that Ishigami could have explained what actually happened, but he chose not to. He was willing to let everyone hate him if it meant protecting someone else, and I think that explains Ishigami's character perfectly. Because underneath all of this complaining, sarcasm, and I hate everyone attitude, he's actually one of the most caring characters in the series, he just doesn't show it. And that's what makes his backstory so important. It explains why Ishigami is so closed off, while also showing us that the person he pretends to be isn't really who he is. And as the series goes on, we get to see that side of Ishigami come out more and more through his relationships with the rest of the cast. Because one of the best things about Kaguya-sama is just how good its characters are together. Because one of the biggest strengths for Yu Ishigami and basically every other character in Kaguya-sama is its character chemistry. A lot of romance anime are built around one central relationship. You have the protagonist, their love interest, maybe a rival, and then a bunch of side characters who exist around them. But Kaguya-sama doesn't really work like that. Almost every character has a completely different dynamic depending on who they're talking to. And Ishigami might be the best example of this. Take the main protagonist, Shirogane. Their relationship is basically the perfect friendship between two complete opposites. Shirogane is constantly trying to prove that he's the perfect student council president, while Ishigami is probably the least interested person in maintaining an image. But despite being so different, they understand each other incredibly well. Shirogane is one of the first people who genuinely gives Ishigami a chance, while Ishigami is one of the few people who can see through Shirogane's fake confidence. Then you can take someone like Kaguya. At first, Ishigami is terrified of her, but eventually that fear turns into something much closer to a sibling relationship. And that's another thing Kaguya-sama does incredibly well. It doesn't force every relationship to be romantic. Some of its best character interactions have absolutely nothing to do with romance. Kaguya and Ishigami can simply exist as two people who understand each other. Then there's Fujiwara, which is basically the complete opposite. Whenever Ishigami and Fujiwara are together, you already know something is going to go horribly wrong. Ishigami's constant cynicism mixed with Fujiwara's complete lack of awareness creates some of the funniest interactions in the series. And then, of course, there's Miko. Their relationship is probably the most complicated of all. They're constantly arguing, they misunderstand each other, and they seem like complete opposites. But underneath all of that, they slowly start to recognize the things that other people don't. Miko realizes that Ishigami isn't the heartless delinquent everyone thinks he is. And Ishigami recognizes that Miko's strict personality is partially hiding someone who's actually incredibly insecure. And that's what makes the relationship so interesting. Not the fact that they're both a potential couple, it's the fact that they change the way they see each other. And then you have Tsubame, who brings out another side of Ishigami entirely. She gives him a reason to actually step outside of his comfort zone and try to become more confident. So when you look at all these relationships together, you start to realize something. There isn't really one definitive version of Ishigami. There's the Ishigami who's Shirogune's friend, the Ishigami who's terrified of Kaguya, the Ishigami who's constantly annoyed by Fujiwara, the Ishigami who can't stop arguing with Miko, and the Ishigami who's desperately trying to become a better version of himself around Tsubame. And somehow all of them feel like the same character. That's incredibly difficult to write because instead of giving Ishigami one personality trait and changing it depending on the situation, Kaguya-sama lets different parts of his personality come out naturally depending on who he's with. That's why the chemistry works so well. Ishigami doesn't just have good relationships, his relationships reveal different parts of his character. And that's exactly what makes the cast of Kaguya-sama so special. You could take Ishigami out of Kaguya-sama and put him into another romance anime, and he'd probably still be a good character, but he wouldn't be nearly as good, because Ishigami works so well because of the cast of Kaguya-sama. Think about what happens whenever you put him next to someone else. Shirogane brings out his loyalty, Kaguya brings out his softer side, Fujiwara brings out his frustration, Miku brings out his empathy, Tsubame brings out his desire to improve. That's just a few characters. This is what makes Kaguya-sama's cast so special. The characters don't have one relationship that defines them, they have different chemistry with every other character in the show. Kaguya isn't just Shirogune's love interest. Shirogane isn't just Kaguya's love interest. It goes on and on. Every character has relationships outside of the central romance, and those relationships create completely different versions of the characters. That's why the student council feels like an actual group of friends rather than four characters who were placed in the same room because the plot needed them to be there. And Ishigami might be the best example of this. You can throw him into almost any situation and get something entertaining, funny, or emotional out of it. That's incredibly, and I mean incredibly difficult to perfect and write. So after everything we've talked about, what actually makes Ishigami the best side character? It's not one thing. It's the fact that he succeeds at basically everything a side character is supposed to do, in my opinion. He's funny without being reduced to comic relief. He's flawed without being unlikable. He has an emotional backstory without that backstory being his entire personality. He has meaningful friendships. He has complicated relationships. He gets his own romantic storyline. And most importantly, his story matters. Ishigami doesn't exist just to help Shirogane and Kaguya's story. He has his own problems, his own goals, his own relationships, and his own journey. But despite all of that, he still manages to make the main characters better. And that's why I think separates an amazing side character from a great one. A great side character makes the world feel bigger because when you watch Ishigami, you don't feel like you're watching a character whose entire existence revolves around the protagonist. You feel like you're watching a real person who just happens to be living in the same world as the protagonist. That's why his backstory hits. That's why his friendships work. That's why his relationship with Miko is so interesting. That's why his comedy lands, because underneath all of it, there's an actual character with an actual story. There are hundreds of amazing side characters in anime. Some are funnier, some are cooler, some have better fights, and some might even have better individual moments. But when I think about what actually makes a great side character, Yu Ishigami checks almost every single box. He has a story worth telling, his relationships are worth caring about, he changes the people around him, and the people around him change him. Most importantly, he never feels like he's only there to support someone else's story. Ishigami feels like he has a life of his own, and ironically, that's exactly what makes him such a perfect side character. Because the best side characters aren't the ones who make you wish they were the main protagonist, they're the ones who make you realize the protagonist's story wouldn't be nearly as good without them. And that's exactly what Yu Ishigami is, the best side character in anime history.